Hey, everybody, welcome back to another exciting edition of the Security Repo Podcast. With us, myself, your host, Dwayne, as always, and our co host extraordinaire, Kayssar. Hey, Kayssar, how you doing today?
Hi everyone, doing great.
Looks like a bright day out there.
Definitely is.
It's good to get good light in the daytime in your windows. It's always makes you feel better. We have us today a ray of sunshine himself. Dustin Lehr is an accomplished software engineer turned executive cybersecurity leader who designs security programs that reinforce proactive behavior to avoid security incidents. He's the co-founder and chief product and tech officer over at Katilyst, spelled with a K. That'll be down in the show notes. They're a company dedicated to helping organizations enhance their culture by building engaging security champion programs. Dustin's also the driving force behind the Security Champion Success Guide. Again, link to that will be in the show notes, and possesses a wealth of experience in application security, providing innovative coaching and consulting services. He's also a prominent security thought leader, speaker, and founder of Let's Talk Software Security, monthly open discussion meetup group. And again, you can find those links down in the show notes. But welcome to the show, Dustin.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I have known you for a few years now. I first saw you speak out at Snowfrock, the OWASP event in Denver, which is coming up pretty soon. In fact, by the time this comes out, I think we'll actually almost be at the event, or maybe right around there. But Snowfrock, check it out. It's a cool event. But I saw you there speak around security champion programs. And I would argue that's how I at least know you the best, is being the person involved in that conversation and building the Security Champions Program Success Guide, which I know I have referenced and pointed people to a number of times. So let's just start there. What is that? What is the Security Champion Program Success Guide?
Yeah, happy to share more about that. I think, just to kind of classify myself fairly, I was you did a fantastic job with the intro and everything, but just to kind of set the stage here, I was a software engineer for over a decade and learned a ton from that side, right? In terms of what is the best way to talk to developers. I had all these thoughts about maybe better approaches that cybersecurity could take. So when I got the chance to join cybersecurity, it was all about that for me. How do I make this a better experience for developers and so forth? And that's kind of where this whole concept of security champions came in. And I really just found security champions to be a great foundation to build the rest of your AppSec program. I think it became such a passion area for me because I saw it work so well. And I through experimenting and lots of mistakes, frankly, I found things that really worked. And for me, if I find something that works that maybe other people are kind of skeptical about, or they're like, well, I don't know if champions programs works, that is so motivating for me to just get out there and try to help other people understand it in the way that I do, right? And show how you can be successful. So that's where the guide came from. Now, if you look at the guide, and I like to explain it in this way, it's not necessarily this sort of prescriptive thing, like just do 3 things and your champion program will be beautiful. It's a lot more of a methodical process that I recommend you go through that starts with things like set your vision, set your mission and goals for your program, understand your environment, and then design an experience that's going to be tailored for your culture. I think that's extremely important when creating a security champion program. So it's a little preview of the guide there, and I'm happy to go into more depth.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Dustin. In your experience, what is the minimum size where a company would benefit from a security champions program?
Yeah, and this is going to go back to what I was just talking about in terms of every company and culture being different. I do think companies of any size could benefit from this, development teams of any size, because when it gets right down to it, it's about finding allies and essentially partners to work with. And that's typically what I recommend is, don't force this. If you've got a development team of 5 people because you're a brand new startup, how are you starting the conversation around security is important. And then there are going to be people that emerge out of the 5, 1 or 2 maybe. who say, you know what, that's cool. I really believe in that. And that's the beginning of your champion program, more or less. Same approach could be applied to 200 developers where you're like, hey, we want to change things for the better. We want a better AppSec situation, et cetera. Who's with me? And you're going to have some people who step up and they're like, you know what, I've been telling people about this for years. Like, I really believe in this. How can I get more involved? But you're also going to have the other side, the other extreme, where some people are just like, I don't care. I'm busy, leave me alone with this stuff. So again, it is really about finding those initial allies, which you can do no matter the size of your dev teams.
And I'm just realizing we haven't paused for. We have a very wide audience here, people all throughout their careers. Could you give us like a quick, like, minute, 2 minute summary of like what on earth is a security champion in this definition?
Oh, that is a great point. We probably should have defined that at first, right? Um, I would actually kind of piggyback on what I was sharing a second ago. I do think that champion programs center around this concept of allies or um, almost liaisons or partners across your organization that are, and this is important, they're not cybersecurity professionals. Okay, so think about it almost like a hub and spoke type of model, right? Where you have your security team who's got a particular set of expertise and skills and so forth, and then you have, the spokes, right? You have folks across the organization that become those middle people, more or less, who are almost conduits, right? Where you can work with them closely. You can help them understand what it means to follow good security practices and so forth. And then they are able to share that, if you encourage this, with the people on their teams. And I think why it works so well in terms of this model is because people are more likely to listen to the people that they know, right, their colleagues, than to that centralized, right, hub um, security team. That is to say, we're expected to talk about security as security professionals. We're so easy to just stick into a box. Well, here comes Dustin again. He's going to talk about security. I'm just going to tune him out, as opposed to, again, my colleague is talking about security. So that's really, in my mind, the model is how do we train up and encourage non cybersecurity professionals across your organization to share and distribute this message of security.
You just said that engineers put more value in the information and the ideas that their co-workers would provide rather than what the security team provides. And I guess that really touches on the notion of trust. I trust my immediate coworker more than I would trust some faraway corporate security team, right? So the question I have for you is, how does the security team establish that trust with security champions and everyone basically when they don't have the same expertise? Because engineers that, I don't know, they care about Java, they care about Kafka, they care about AWS. They don't necessarily care about security. So how do you establish that rapport?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with just a desire, right, to connect with folks and build those types of relationships. I think it's getting outside of your comfort zone. I mean, I think a lot of security folks fall into the category of, um, maybe a little more reclusive, if you will, a little more interested in tech and computers rather than maybe building relationships across an organization. But the value for doing so, I have absolutely learned. Like, as a heads down engineer, I was not that way whatsoever. I was very much leave me alone. I'm trying to get work done. Do you want to talk, or do you want me to do stuff and fix things and build code, right? But I have absolutely learned the importance of not just doing the things, but also talking about those things, communicate with others. Here's what I'm building, here's why, and so forth, because it's so important. You can influence other people, you can sort of change the direction that others are taking, you can, more or less increase the productivity of what you're, or at least what you're trying to accomplish through others as well. You're not just a lone person. Now, how do you establish that relationship? I think it has to do with a lot of listening, a lot of give and take of information here too, which is where I think this whole concept of the ivory tower, right, where a lot of security teams have lived traditionally, doesn't work. And it's not even that of an effective approach. If it feels like, hey, we're the security team, we know everything, so we're just going to tell everyone what to do, not only is that not going to be adopted very well, that's going to create issues, but it's also not really true either. There's a ton of stuff that you can learn from your developers. Do you have, as a security team who's, like you said, sort of this external body, do they have the amount of knowledge about the code base, the architecture, the way things were built, why they were built, where the bodies are buried, in the same level as the developers know? So really, this relationship should be established as a way to share information, that everyone comes to the table with what they know, and it's the combination of all that information that creates the most value.
I, I would love to hear a little bit about how you arrived at this. You said you were a practitioner, you were an engineer, and you were at Staples, I believe, when you first started your first program, or what became Security Champion program. Like, what did that look like? What's the actual story on the ground with that?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, and it was a very quick move for me. So, like I mentioned, I was a software engineer for over a decade. I got into app architecture. I was like, tech lead for uh, building a few different apps, leading developers and so forth. But I always had a bit of a quality focus as well. So, I was heads down, but I also wanted to make sure that the software we were building was good. Um, so it was a pretty natural jump for me to go into cybersecurity as a AppSec architect. Essentially, was the first position that I landed in cybersecurity. This was at Staples, where I made that jump. And then it was only a few months actually until they asked me to lead the AppSec team completely. So it was very much like, okay, you're a developer, cool. Welcome to cybersecurity. We think that you can do a lot here. Okay, well, why don't you just be a leader in cybersecurity, just like that? So it was kind of a major mindset shift. And I do remember, because part of what we were trying to do at Staples is scale AppSec. And this is the responsibility that I was put in charge of. And I remember sitting in a room with the other AppSec engineers, and we're like, how are we going to do this? Like, we've got some scan tools, we've got these things, we've got a few teams that we've worked with. How are we going to actually do this at scale across the company? And a lot of the roads started to lead back to security champions. How are we going to do threat model? Like, if you look at the SDLC, which is how I really like to define what AppSec even is, what is AppSec? In my view, it's putting the right security measures into the process, into the SDLC, right, into the development process. So we're like, how are we going to do the left side things? How are we going to do scanning? Who's going to triage? Who's going to help with this and that? And champions just kept coming as a theme to the table. And we're like, you know what? Then we need an awesome champion program. Um, and, we tried a few things. Like, there were some things that I will admit did not work whatsoever. One of the examples would be, we tried a very hardcore threat modeling lesson as one of the first meetings that we had with the champions, and we lost people. It was just too much at first. So we really realized that, hey, we need to start with the foundation and start with basic principles and all that stuff, and sort of build folks' knowledge up to being able to do this, instead of just brain dumping on them. Here's everything we know, like, now you know it too, let's go. It just didn't work. So that's an example of a lesson that we learned, and we learned a ton of others as well. But I think over time we created a pretty amazing program that still exists today.
So, if I try to push the boundaries of what you just said earlier, um, it sounds to me like basically your security champions were just the engineers who had to deal with all the security stuff, who had to do the triage, who had to fix the bugs. But of course, I really hope I'm not correct. So, what is, like, in your experience, what is the best mix of the security champion does the security work and the other engineers do the other work? Do you see where I'm getting at?
I do, and I have certainly refined my approach over the years as well. I think what I was saying in terms of sitting in that room trying to figure out how we're going to scale, um, I think a lot more of those responsibilities we were thinking should be on the engineering side. And I don't necessarily agree with that now. So I'm kind of sharing my journey here, more or less. Because I agree with you. I do think it's a mistake to use champions as a way to pass off security responsibilities. I think there's a lot of issues with that. One of them would be they don't necessarily have time. They're not getting paid for all this extra work. They don't necessarily have the expertise to do so. So the approach that I recommend now is much more of that information sharing approach that I said earlier. There are certain things that developers know that they can already bring to the table that provides a ton of value. And there are certain things that the security team knows that they could also bring to the table and provide a ton of value, right? So let's just take a few examples. I want to talk about threat modeling, and I want to talk about scanning. So when it comes to threat modeling, my favorite exercises when it comes to threat modeling are get developers and security people together, virtually or with the classic whiteboard approach, and start to talk about the system, that you're focusing on, um, and allow both sides to bring their concerns to the table, right? So developers, again, they know where the bodies are buried, right? And so forth. Hey, I'm a little concerned about that. I just coded this up the other day, or we've got this in the design today. I'm a little concerned about that. Here's why. I don't even know why, but doesn't feel right. Security team can come in with their knowledge and say, well, here are the best practices. Are you doing this? Are you doing that? Right. And then it's the combination of that knowledge that, in my view, produces the best threat model. That's way better than asking the dev team to do it alone. And it's way better than having the security team do the threat modeling alone. The other example is scanning, triaging specifically, right? I think that triaging should be a joint effort to some extent because the scan results, as we all know, not all of them are perfect, and there's a lot of false positives. I'll just focus on SAST for now, right? um, I do think that the security team should take an initial look at all results and make sure that they are not only tuning the tool based on the stuff that they're seeing, but taking a little bit of time to just make sure that they're passing like the sniff test, the basic test, right? Does this make sense? Is this a legitimate finding, et cetera, to the extent that they know the code base? But that knowledge only goes so far in terms of that specific system or code base that then the developers should be relied on to kind of take it from there, right? And do the rest of the triage, if you will. So that's typically how I think about kind of this joint partnership.
Yeah,
I
that
know that was a
definitely
long answer. I hope that makes sense.
it makes great sense. So, but it kind of raises another question. If we try to step back a little, and let's imagine that I am the CEO or the CTO of a mid-sized company, and you, Dustin, are coming in and you're advising me to start a security champion program. My question to you is why? Why should I, an executive at a company, why should I care about the security champion program?
Boy, there's a great question. There's a lot of rabbit holes I think we can go down on this one. I do think that in general, executives are looking at things like cost savings, money, the money side. I also think they're looking at it and should look at it from a risk perspective too. So specifically, how are we identifying risk, and then how are we addressing risk across our company in line with our risk appetite and all of that stuff? Again, there's a lot of detail here, but I think to summarize, you do need to make a case in terms of those things. How are we maybe finding more risk across the company because of the champions? I have told many stories and shared a lot of instances where we just wouldn't have known about many things without the champions bringing things to the surface. We've got a smaller team, we can't be everywhere. So having eyes and ears across the company to bring up things, hey, I saw this the other day, or is this a concern, or whatever. If you don't have a strong relationship established with your org, you're not going to hear about those things at all. So that's an issue in itself. And then how do you treat those things as well is also a very important thing too. And I know I'm kind of going on a tangent. I want to come back to the cost thing as well, but how are you reinforcing people actually reporting these issues? I think is very important too. Do you use them as an example, and sort of punish folks for making mistakes, or do you take an approach where you're really reinforcing people telling you about issues that maybe even they've introduced? So again, if you have a solid program, you're just going to hear more about those things. And then in terms of addressing risk, like we talked about, that shared model to help you understand more about the risk, et cetera, and then reduce that risk, I think is also important in terms of storytelling. Not to mention just time to remediation and so forth. I think I'm a data nerd. I'm like a reporting person. Like I really enjoy capturing the right metrics and sharing those with the org. Let me give you an example of one that I've actually used with success, and that's how often are people bringing us in to the conversation. I have measured that specifically as a way to demonstrate that there's a good relationship between the security team and the dev team, and that it's easy to measure. Okay, where are the Jira tickets that were not created by us, they were created by others, where they've brought us in, they've tagged us, or they've assigned it to us, or something that shows, again, two things. One, there's a relationship there because they know who to bring in. And two, they actually find value from what we do. Otherwise, they wouldn't bring us in. Like, how many situations have you heard of where people are avoiding the security team? They don't want to bring them in at all because they think they're going to interfere, or they just don't provide value. So in terms of a specific metric, you can show that. You can show a graph of that. Are more and more people bringing us into stuff, or is the opposite happening, which means we have a relationship problem? And then let me just briefly talk about the cost side. I do think that leaders are going to respond well if you're not using like the FUD techniques that we hear of, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The sky is falling. If we don't do this, everything's going to blow up. I don't think that necessarily works. I do think what works, especially from a development standpoint, is, how much time are we wasting and, fixing production issues constantly? Like how much of our sprint is tasks are not able to be met because we're distracted with production issues and so forth. So can we better design our systems to prevent those types of issues, which will actually create a productivity boost that you can measure? And you can measure that in terms of time of the developers being spent on actual feature delivery in the sprint versus being distracted by all these things. So I think that's a really good way to demonstrate the value of these shift left or preventative techniques.
A lot in there to unpack, man. But love it all. The it makes sense. Like intellectually, it makes perfect sense. Like, hey, we're moving the company in the right direction. And I think if you got in the right audience or the right executives, yes, this totally makes sense. But still relating like tickets and technically like we're getting better to ROI, that's tricky. So what else are we measuring? I know that's your work at Katilyst. That's one of your focus points is how do we actually turn these good feelings and these good numbers like in the actual flow to hard numbers that we can take back to the board and it's like we invested well.
Yeah, and I think this is tricky, and I think it's difficult in general, let's be fair, to demonstrate that for your cybersecurity efforts overall. Okay, so to some extent, what you're asking is how do we solve the perception of cybersecurity and the investment that folks are making when it comes to cybersecurity,
Yeah, if you could
period.
just solve that for the entire industry right now on this
I
podcast,
know,
we would
and
appreciate
that's why I'm trying to frame it like this, because I do think that we haven't necessarily, as an industry, really been able to solve that yet. You know, like how many CISOs get asked the same types of questions, like, are you just a cost center, or are you actually like, what's the value that we're bringing? Why do you need more budget next year? What are you going to do with it? How is this going to address, you know, the risk that you've identified, or whatever it is? So now a few thoughts about all of that. um, you know, I think if you get down to numbers, like we were just talking about, and talking about efficiency and time spent doing certain things and so forth, and then really capture your risk appetite and how what you're doing aligns with that. That is to say, have conversations as a security leader with the business side to understand their level of risk that they're willing to put up with, you know, and that varies. It varies per industry. It varies based on the size of your company. Do you have product market fit, as an example? Um, you know, think about whether the priority of security is really number one versus actually keeping the business going, as an example. So it gets tricky, and I know that I'm not like, I just don't think it's possible for me to sit here and list, you know, the three metrics that are going to change everything when it comes to cybersecurity. So I'm hoping I can share kind of some insights here instead.
I think
Um,
that's actually really important to understand and take away from this. I've talked to several people about security champion programs. They're like, yes, it's a mandatory program I'm enforcing to improve our security overall. And here's the metrics of like how we're going to measure that. I'm like, I don't think you're describing a security champion program anymore. You're describing a security regimen with a very big stick and very few carrots.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot, and I think that this comes down to the goal setting. Like I mentioned, this security champion guide that I put together. The first step is literally come up with the vision for your program that includes goals, specific goals, measurable goals, SMART goals, and ideally those would align up the chain, right? So does your champion program's goals align with your AppSec program's goals? Does that align with your cybersecurity program's goals? Does that align with your company's goals? I think that's important to connect all of those. And if you're unable to speak to how what you're doing in your champion program does connect to the company goals, you are going to have issues across the board. So, yeah, I do think it's extremely important to take the time and really figure out what you're trying to do. The other thing that's become very clear that I've shared with many folks now is, why can't your champion program goals essentially just be your AppSec program goals? That is to say, when you're designing your champion program, you should think about, in my view, that you're essentially designing your AppSec program, because I think that your champions become a necessary vehicle to be successful for all the things that you're doing AppSec. we talked about threat modeling, we talked about scanning, triage, etc. Like there's a part for your champions to play there. And I think that's really important because otherwise I think people almost put it in this other bucket. Like we do AppSec stuff and then we have this champion program thing too over here. And it's kind of fun. It's like, no. Those need to be the same. Like you need to tie them in. The champions have to be doing something that's contributing to your AppSec goals overall. So a couple more thoughts because I do want to help people really understand how you can come up with good metrics here. And I think a good foundation to think about is really not thinking about it in terms of direct causation either. I talk about this a lot, that the correlation versus causation approach, right? It comes up in training too. Like, why do we do secure code training? How do you measure the ROI of that investment? Well, you can't really measure it directly. Okay, you literally cannot say because some developer took training, they were about to code up a vulnerability, but then they remembered their training and they didn't. Like, how could you ever show that? Right? So instead, what you have to show is a few different correlations. And I like to think about two of them. One of them is just simple A/B, right? This group has access to more training, they've taken more training, etc. What does their vulnerability rate look like, escape rate, or however you want to measure it, versus those who haven't? Or from a champions lens, how do your teams with champions perform when it comes to certain metrics versus the teams without champions? Or how do your champions specifically perform versus non-champions? And I've taken that approach, and that's been pretty successful in terms of just showing an ROI. This is the value of champions. The other way to measure it is like a before and after state as well. Before champions, here's how things were going. Here's our vulnerability rate. Here's the relationship we had with the org, right, that we talked about earlier. Here it is after we implemented champions, or here's a specific team before they had a champion and then after. Those are all things you can show. And I think if you show those graphs, it's pretty easy for leaders to understand the value.
All right, sounds good. So, if I wanted to start a security champion program at my company, what would be the tools that I would use to build that program? And by tools, I mean anything. It can be meetings, weekly meetings. It can be a Slack channel. It can be email. It can be, I don't know, a threat intel feed. So, what are the tools to build a security program?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the work that we do at Katilyst centers around this, and also a lot of this comes out in the guide as well. There are themes that come out. Every program is different, but I do think there are some basics that you need to do. The first one is take the time to design your program, like we were talking about. Figure out, right, the vision, the mission, how, what specific goals and metrics you're going to measure and so forth. The other common theme that comes up all the time that I typically recommend doing is, like you said, a regular community meeting of some sort centered around learning something. There's a lot of different options you can do there. You can bring in guest speakers to talk about things. You can have champions talk about things. You can have open discussions. You can share, information about how the security team functions. There's a lot of different things that you can cover in those, but bringing everyone together often, I think, is a good idea. Regular engagement is also absolutely necessary, meaning, and I do like the idea of a Slack channel or some sort of way for the community to sort of be together in the same space. But you can't just throw everyone there and expect them to do stuff. Like, you as the security team, you have to put effort into prompting conversation, asking questions, sharing things, like livening the conversation more or less. So consistent engagement, I think, is extremely important as well. And then there's the motivational pieces. We haven't even talked about this yet. You know, when you actually recruit champions and you find allies across the organization, how do you actually reinforce and encourage and incentivize them to take action? Because just knowing stuff, in my view, is not enough. And this is where I think the security awareness approaches go wrong as well, or they just don't do enough. You know, like putting up posters and helping people understand the importance of security is half of it. The other half is, now that you know stuff, you need to do stuff. You know, there are actions, etc., that you can actually take. Now the question is, how do you actually reinforce those actions? So there's a lot of motivational, you know, kind of like behavioral science and gamification techniques that I've certainly learned how to lean into. And I think that's an important part of your program too. Why would anyone do anything otherwise if you haven't set up a cool or fun or engaging experience?
Right on. That all sounds very soft skillsy, if you see what I mean. So let's move on to a bit more hard skills type question. What is your favorite security focused command line tool?
Ah, okay. Yeah. So, you know, when it comes to command, so I've always gotten a lot of, when I'm doing analysis, especially when it comes to how an app works or whatever it is, um, or is there something potentially malicious going on, or what does the activity look like? I have used like Wireshark. This used to be the Ethereal, I think, back in the day, but it's sort of grown to Wireshark, and that's typically one that I use. Yeah, and then I mean, there's the classic Nmap as well. Uh, so yeah, I kind of stick to those command line wise. Otherwise, classic like SQL. Like I'm always looking at asset inventory and sort of understanding the environment as well. Um, T-Shark, sorry, that just came to me. So T-Shark is kind of the command line version of Wireshark. Um, yeah, and then lots of analysis. Like I do a lot of analysis around again the assets that exist across the company, and what I'll typically do. I know this is a little bit off of the command line question, but I like to build systems that bring in information through APIs and so forth into a central repository, so I can really understand the structure um, of the system, right? The architecture that's out there, because I think that really provides a lot of information for scanning and threat modeling and just prioritization in general. So
Yeah, sounds good. So you spoke about analysis. Let's talk about analyzing recruitment candidates. What is your go-to interview question when hiring for security positions?
yeah, so a couple things come to mind, and maybe the first one is something we can debate because it might even be against best practice. But I find it to be extremely useful, especially on the soft skills side that you mentioned. Um, I like the idea of asking people. Typically, the first question that I'll ask folks is, uh, "Tell me about yourself. Tell me about your career. I can see your LinkedIn. You don't have to give me your resume, but tell me about it in your own words. Like, how did you get from where you are, where you were, to where you are today?" And why. I really kind of want to dig into your interests at that point, which I think why I like this question is a couple of reasons. One, it allows them to talk about something they know very well, right? So they don't have to kind of wing it or pretend they know something that they don't. Um, and I like to see how they talk about it. Like, can they essentially sort of sell themselves? Like, how do they actually speak about something that they really know well? And then the other side of that is, as a leader, I always start with interest. Okay. I like to align, and I see the leader's mission here as aligning what people's interests are with the goals that you have to meet for your team. You're not going to like, you're going to find the right person for the job that's based on interest. So that first question really helps me understand their interest as well. What are you interested in, more or less? And then from a technical standpoint, I do like to ask, what happened? Like if you type a URL in a browser, tell me what happens next. Okay. And I think I like that question because we all use the internet. We all use browsers every day. What's actually happening there behind the scenes, right? Can you actually explain how the URL is resolved to an IP address, and then there's a server, and you let them sort of elaborate into what they know in terms of how the internet works, which I just think is so crucial.
How deep do you get into that sort of question? Do you ask people about CPU interrupts and what happens when you hit the key on the keyboard?
I mean, it depends. It's kind of one of those open questions where I like to dig into certain details on specific things, kind of based on what I see that they know. Because, okay, here's the thing with interviews, and this always drives me nuts, and I'm just going to share this live. People know stuff. People know stuff. Maybe they don't know the very specific thing that you're asking. And I think a lot of interviews bother me because it's like, I'm going to ask you one very specific question. If you don't know the answer, you're out. Right? How many interviews have you had that were like that? That's terrible, in my opinion. That's a terrible interview. I think the interviewer should take the time to probe so that they can figure out what this person does know. Maybe they don't know exactly the answer to your very specific question, but they know something. So, what do they know? And I do think this question is a really good way to break that down. Are they a little bit more on the maybe hardware side, and they can go into depth in terms of you hit enter, right? Like to your point, what happens? How does the keyboard, right, interact with the OS and interrupt and all the stuff that's going on there? Versus maybe they just have more of an app level understanding, right? You type it into the URL, what happens server wise, architecturally, et cetera. Or maybe they go into details in terms of how the page is rendered, like when it comes back, right, from the server, how is that rendered? Like what are the steps there from a front end standpoint? That could also be interesting. So again, I kind of leave that open, and I like to kind of probe and figure out what they know from there.
They're giving me nightmare flashbacks of one of the worst interviews I ever had. Was like, all right, walk me through the entire JavaScript request cycle. It's like, what? Like, I'm interviewing for a DevRel position, and they're like, yeah, but a DevRel should know that. I'm like, do you know that? He's like, well, I'm not the one in the interview. And I was like, all right, well, that's kind of a weird way to phrase that. I'm not going to work for you. And that was a good interview question in that regard, because I ended up being like, all right, well, see ya. Last questions we always ask all of our guests. Super appreciate you being here, but we're running out of time, unfortunately. Best advice, worst advice. What's the best advice that you're currently hearing out there, or that you're currently able to give someone out in the security space? And then we'll ask about the worst one next.
Yeah, I think I'll follow the same theme here around security champions. We touched on this a little bit, but I do think that when you think about cybersecurity, especially AppSec, you should think about how you are trying to induce a change across your organization. So really leaning into techniques that help you make that change, including champions, including just kind of best practices when it comes to change management, proper communication, all of that sort of stuff. That's the advice I would give. Really lean into these concepts. They're well known. There are ways that people are influenced. There's behavioral science. There's a whole field dedicated to understanding people. So I would give the advice to lean into that. Really understand what makes people tick, how to influence them, how to make change across your organization.
I love that. I keep telling people, and I keep coming into it in security, is like, it is a people business. That's the entire point. Like, if we don't have a human-centered focus in security, we're kind of doing it wrong because like I'm not trying to defend the machine because I don't really care about the machine. I'll get a new machine. I don't really care. But what does that machine hold? Like, what's the actual PII? What's the ramifications if that machine does go down? Is always comes back to human centric things. So I love that. So, last question: worst advice. What's the worst advice you think's floating around out there in cybersecurity land?
Well, I think it's kind of the opposite. I think that is too much focus on just tech only solutions when I do think we need to be focusing a lot more on the people side. And I think maybe what is creating that issue is maybe folks don't believe others can learn or change or grow or whatever that is, like maybe it feels like cybersecurity is this very specialized space and we have this special knowledge that nobody else can learn. And I just think that's completely misguided. And I think we need to spend more time really, again, understanding people and how to influence them because I think it's possible. And I think if you do that successfully, you are going to create allies across your organization who are going to help you with scaling security effectively, right? They're out there if they're smarter when it comes to security and they can learn and you believe they can learn. You're going to create an army, if you will, of defenders, right, for your company. So I think leaning into that is a good idea.
I think I love that. I love that because if we could just solve this with tech, if we could just slap a technology on top of it and solve all of security, we would have done it by now. I'm pretty sure CrowdStrike would have tried to sell it to us. So this is the end of the interview. Thanks for being on our podcast. Thanks for being here. But we always like to give our guests a final say. Like, there's any final words you want to give us, a good chance to plug, like where we can follow you and where we should follow your adventures.
Yeah, certainly. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I appreciate the chance, by the way. I'm active on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to me if you hear anything that you have more questions on. Katilyst is here to help as well. You mentioned the Let's Talk Software Security meetup group. I would encourage anybody who wants to talk about software security to show up to that. It's an open discussion we have every month about a specific AppSec topic. It is just a ton of fun. We talk for 2 hours. It's not long enough. There's practitioners there are vendors there, but we try to keep the sales pitches to a minimum, and it's just a lot of fun. So I would recommend that as well. And then the success guide, if you're looking to create a security champion program, would recommend checking that out as well. So thanks for having me. I really appreciate this.
Well, thanks a lot for being here, everybody. If you made it this far, remember to like, remember to subscribe, tell your friends. If you hated this show, tell your enemies and send it to people you didn't like and want to waste their time. But definitely they'll get better at security, and then maybe you'll like them more. So send this to everybody. Kayssar, thanks again. Any final sign-off words from you?
It's been a pleasure having you on the show today, Dustin. And I will definitely look into deploying a Security Champions program. I have to say, it hasn't been my focus at this point, but it definitely puts things into perspective.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll run into each other at another conference soon. So thanks for being here. Have a good one.
Of course. Thanks for having me.